So, how did African American slaves survive the trauma of slavery? That's a very interesting question. And one thing that was recognized as playing a part in this, and this is through the testimony of ex slaves, as well as historians and social scientists looking into Southern slavery. One way to maintain their dignity is through slave culture. And this was actually addressed by Douglass in the book when he talked about the songs being sung by slaves while they labored, right? So slaves were able to form this sort of independent sphere where, at least, it's something that the white owners could not penetrate, right? Um, the family, certainly, even though you don't see, the typical formation of family, obviously, because most likely families will be separated. But if you were able to maintain some semblance of family, and then you also had religion, and then you also had cultural expression, namely through singing, because as you know, you can't really write or read as a slave unless you're ingenious like Frederick Douglass, who found a way to do this um, behind the backs of their owners, right? But what you have here, cumulatively speaking, is this emergent culture that arises from their experiences. And again, I have to remind you that this serves as a buffer against the dehumanizing effects of slavery. Now, when it comes to families, as I just noted, many families were broken up due to this forced separation and, of course, the sale of family members. But still, the bonds of family remain strong if they were there. Though the law didn't recognize these slave marriages, of course, they're outlawed by law in the South. Sometimes the master consented to unions that were sort of unofficial. In fact, there was this tradition known as, quote, jumping the broomstick, where basically that symbolized a marriage, right? Even though it's, again, informal and unofficial, African Americans practice this cultural expression where they symbolize their union between husband and wife, quote unquote, of course, by jumping the broomstick, right? They physically jump the broom. This is similar to exchange of rings, right? Marriage rings. And many of these marriages would actually last a lifetime. So my whole point here is there's this attempt to maintain some semblance of regular life, despite their dehumanization, right, and their relegation as chattel slavery. That's a term that you may not be aware of. Chattel. Basically, that refers to slavery whereby the slaves are treated as if they're, quote, beasts of burden, right? Like mules or, domestic livestock, or they're just doing work, like, and again, it's the most menial work done in a way that dehumanizes slaves. Now, of course, you have slave rebellions and slave resistance. Okay, first of all, let me note that slave rebellions are actually the most extreme example of resistance. And I'll get to slave rebellion in a second, but the whole idea of just resistance is important to African American life when it was during the slavery era. Okay, a culture of resistance, so to say, developed among these slaves. Now, interestingly enough, historians have compared the, quote, culture of resistance, unquote, in the United States compared to other slave societies at the same time, like in Brazil, in parts of the Caribbean. You may be aware of the fact that Haiti, the nation of Haiti today, has its origins as a successful slave rebellion against their French slave owning masters, right? But nonetheless, when historians and social scientists compare it to other slave societies, let's say in the Caribbean, they notice that in the United States, they're less organized and less widespread. And if anything, that's bespeaks the degree to which slave societies are heavily enforced in the United States of America at this time. But nonetheless, you do see forms of resistance. Now, at the sort of micro level, you have these individual acts of defiance. Okay, and then at the macro level, you have full on slave rebellions, which I'll talk about in a second. But first, what about these individual acts of defiance? Well, you could see this in what you could call passive resistance, or another name used is non confrontational resistance. Okay, it's not direct confrontation, obviously, but you do things as a slave that disrupts the plantation routine while giving you a sense of dignity as a human being at the same time. Okay, what are examples of these? Things like slowing down your work, right? Doing poor work, or, in other words, foot dragging, right? Destruction of property is one that was practiced. For example, the slave owner or the overseer of the plantation might instruct a slave to mend some fences or to build some fences to keep the livestock in, but lo and behold, what do? They forgot to nail in a few nails, and the shoddy work refers to, the livestock escaping and causing problems on the plantation, so on and so forth. All right, so things like that, feigning illness was a common one. So you have all this ways in everyday life that were manifestations or attestations of, this will to resist. Now, you also have the option of trying to run away to become a fugitive slave. But this is risky, it should be noted. Most fugitive slaves were not successful. Um, and nonetheless, some tried to do this. You followed the North Star. You search for the Underground Railroad that takes you north, right? You may have heard of these stories. And then again, on the most extreme level, or at the macro level, to use their term, you see slave revolts, slave rebellions. And two of the most memorable ones historically uh, was the Denmark Vesey, or were the Denmark Vesey rebellions and the Nat Turner rebellions. Okay, so the first one, Denmark Vesey, happened in 1822. And basically, Vesey, by the way, his last name is spelled Vessey. Denmark Vesey actually quoted the Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal, when he was trying to recruit his co-conspirators, his co-rebels, right? And then you see Nat Turner happened the next decade in 1931. And this is probably the best known of the slave rebellions. In fact, a movie was made about the Nat Turner Rebellion uh, uh, a few years back. It was called Birth of a Nation. But basically, Turner believed that God had chosen him to lead a black uprising against, the white slave societies. So what they did is they actually believe in, full-on violence. They basically murdered any white Southerner that they encountered as they rebelled. In fact, in just a few days, in several days, they murdered more than 50 whites that they encountered. And as you could predict, this sent shockwaves throughout the entire South. And it would lead to things like increasing the physical punishment of innocent slaves, even, right? To try to quell that sort of impulse towards rebellion. Increase in executions. And then you see new laws passed to strengthen slavery in the South, like, prohibition against black preachers, banning even free blacks from owning firearms. You see these patrol systems really becoming strengthened. Uh, the patrol systems and the militias basically went out there to try to surveil the area and make sure there were no, fugitive slaves. So, this is the result of this cultural resistance, but nonetheless, it's important to emphasize this. And as related to Douglas's refutation and deconstruction of this notion of, quote, the happy slave, unquote. Well, if anything, this cultural resistance, especially slave rebellion, it gives a lie to that idea of the happy slave, right? It's a constant challenge to the slaveholder's image as their slave system as this sort of benign institution, right? This benign or harmless, in other words, paternalist or paternal institution. And, it gives a lie to the belief that slaves were these obedient and happy subjects, that they're grateful and, again, happy and cheerful for their own owner's care. So now let's go over this list here, which is sort of this constellation of arguments and beliefs that were advanced by the southern states in their defense of slavery. Now, it should be noted here, slavery is being attacked, right, from moral grounds, from the abolitionists, especially, which we will discuss very shortly in the next video. But here is how they defended themselves, how they argued that, what's being practiced here is hardly immoral. In fact, it's moral. Now, let me begin by the obvious argument that I didn't list here, and it was this, that slavery had always existed since the beginning of humankind. Why are we being condemned for it? All right. But again, let me remind you as well that this is the modern times, and in modern life, people that live in modern civilizations do not believe in slavery. They believe that it is morally bankrupt and repugnant. No one believes that someone should be a slave, right? That slavery is a just society in modern life, and of course that's true today because arguably we still live in modern times. Okay, so here's the Southern defense of slavery. The first one we don't have to review because I spent more time on this because it's something that is really part of that Southern way of life, and it's so wrapped up in lies, right? And it's this mythic rendition of plantation life. But the argument here, again, just to summarize, is that slavery is a, quote, positive good. A positive good. Why? Because there's this relation of mutual gain on both sides. All right, now moving on, this is something I've also addressed. And it's the belief in the inherent inferiority of persons of African descent. Now, obviously, this connects with the first one. And this idea that slaves would not survive if not for the benevolence and the care of their masters. Just like you have unsupervised children who are very young, they couldn't survive or can't survive. Well, so too with slaves because they're really on the same level, according to this idea of, belief in the inherent inferiority of African Americans. Now, another one, which is more legal, and it's actually kind of a strong argument. Now, when I say that, I'm not justifying slavery, but, economically, if you argue this, not only economically, but legally, it is something that's enforced by the Constitution. That's the idea that slaves were property by law. Therefore, There's the rule of law here. You can't just take away someone's property. And this goes back to the colonial era, right? We discussed how property was sacrosanct in the minds of the English, and that proceeds forward to Americans, of course. So, if you take away legal property, well, that's a violation, clear violation of freedom, and indeed, this was used quite often, right? Uh, because private property is the bedrock of American liberty, as I just kind of addressed. Okay, now the fourth one is really interesting, and to be frank, my personal opinion, as well as probably yours, it's ludicrous. But it's a biblical defense, and it's based on the story in the Bible called the Curse of Ham. Now, Ham was a son of Noah, and if you know anything about the story of Noah, Noah was chosen by God before God decided to flood the world. Noah was chosen to build, well, he was directed to build an ark and to, put some animals in there. Probably heard the story. And then God proceeded to flood the world wide to get rid of that degeneration, moral degeneration and sin that characterized the world. And it's the idea of cleansing, right? To cleanse the world and begin again, to regenerate after the flood. Now, Ham, again, is a son who survived, obviously, because he's a family member. But after the flood, as Noah and his family began to settle, the story is in the Bible that Ham actually saw Noah in a state of, I guess, being naked, disrobed, right? And because of this, it angered Noah, and Ham was cursed to leave the family and to roam the earth. And according to the Bible, again, the story, the curse, part of the curse of Ham was that wherever Ham ended up settling, that his descendants would become slaves. So, according to the curse of Ham, where do you think Ham ended up? According to those who believe that the curse of Ham applied to persons of African descent, where do you think he ended up? Well, the place we call Africa today is where Ham supposedly ended up. So, therefore, persons of African descent, according to this biblical defense of slavery, were cursed to be enslaved by God. So, therefore, the curse of Ham applies to those even in the United States. And therefore, you can see how that applies to political ideas or ideology, right? That they are banished from this, this the idea of freedom, right? Because they're cursed. All right, so the last one is actually a very strong argument because there's an element of truth to it. And again, I'm not saying therefore slavery is justifies, right? I'm just echoing the Southern viewpoint. So the idea is this: as we know, you see the beginning of industrialization by this time, the 1850s, and you see this idea of the wage laborer in the factory. Let's call him or her a factory worker, right? And they're making a wage and they have no rights whatsoever. And this wage labor is being accused as a form of slave labor. And again, there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, not just an element of truth, as I mentioned earlier, actually a lot of truth. So basically, Southern defenders of slavery, apologists of slavery, are accusing the North of being hypocrites, basically saying, if you look at your institution called, commercialism and industrialization, there's actually a worse form of slavery being, within your system. Okay. Um, In other words, you see the exploitation of these wage workers. At the same time, these apologists say, our slaves are being treated humanely because of paternalism. So the last point here um, actually hooks up with a paternalist belief that slaves were happy and grateful, right? And they're treated humanely like part of the extended family. All right. So, by the way, the guy who's famous for extending this argument was a Southern intellectual, a Southern academic. His name was George Fitzhugh, and that last name is spelled Fitzhugh, George Fitzhugh. So, and again, you have to say that the legal arguments and perhaps the last one are very strong arguments from the Southern perspective, right? But nonetheless, of course, moralism trumps everything. It overrides all of these. So um, this cluster of arguments, again, were important to stave off that accusation of the South as being, uh, you know, mired in this immoral institution of slavery, something that should be eradicated immediately. And who's saying this? The abolitionists, which we'll talk about with the next video.